Hello and welcome to Newsclick. Today we have with us Professor Vijay Prashad, and we are going to discuss the situation in Libya as it is moving. Vijay, good to have you with us.
Thank you so much.
When we look at Libya, the assumptions that a lot of the people seem to have made is a no-fly zone is relatively simple. All we have to do is to proclaim that Gaddafi shouldn't fly his planes, and that's about it. But obviously it means action from air against the air defenses, and now as it transpires also the coalition has moved into taking out what it calls Gaddafi's ground forces. So how do you see this no-fly zone as it was passed in the Security Council and what it seems to have now developed into?
Well, Security Council Resolution 1973 is strictly following a cardinal aspect of UN protocol, which suggests that the UN has the so-called obligation to protect citizens or civilians. So the initial aim of that resolution of 1973 was that all necessary measures may be taken to protect civilians. Now, the problem is, as the African Command of the United States military has found, how do you differentiate between civilians and how do you differentiate between, say, the armed combatants or the rebels who are civilians who have taken up arms? So, therefore, if the American and French planes are to protect civilians, how do they know that they are not also protecting and helping the rebels? To protect and help the rebels is technically a violation of Resolution 1973, which is just an obligation to protect civilians. So this resolution passed by the Security Council was very poorly drafted. The agenda is very unclear, and indeed the phrase all necessary measures has confused a lot of people. Does this simply mean a no-fly zone, or does this mean a no-fly zone where they can attack munitions dumps as they've done yesterday, where they can attack Gaddafi's compound, etc. So Resolution 1973 is legally very complicated, it's not clear, and on the ground, even the American military has said that they are very confused about how to put this into operation.
Vijay, if you really look at it, the fact that it is vague, in fact, and it is poorly drafted, in fact, supports the thesis that there was a different agenda right from the beginning.
Yes, in fact, that is one way to look at it. And the way to understand this is if you look at the debate in the Security Council, the Indian representative and the Brazilian representative made precisely this point, that the wording is too vague, that there are other alternatives, and that there could be a dangerous direction if the full implication of the wording is taken, which is why 5 countries, including India and Brazil, abstained from voting on this resolution. The other 2 significant abstentions were China and Russia. Nobody exercised a veto. It is also, of course, quite problematic that nobody voted against the resolution. But in the Security Council, an abstention is quite a serious, sense of doubt about the efficacy of a resolution. And this is what they had said. So it's not the question that people were unclear going into it, what this resolution was to be about. The warning was already put before the council before the vote, and nonetheless the resolution passed, and this is where we are today. You cannot say that we are here today because we were not warned. The warning was made inside the council, not just outside by critics of humanitarian intervention or so-called humanitarian intervention.
Vijay, if we look at what's happening, it's clear that Gaddafi still remains enough firepower to hold on to the territory that he already has. So effectively, it would mean a prolonged period of civil war unless his military forces really break up with him, which doesn't seem likely at the moment. So this would seem to imply a much longer period of civil war with NATO troops, which seem to have come in today, providing really defense for the Benghazi alliance. And this, in fact, would lead to a situation of either a prolonged civil war or a future occupation by the armed forces of the NATO countries.
Yes, well, there is very little question that right now the rebels will be able to break through by themselves without, say, anti-tank weaponry, without significant firepower and logistical help. So the rebels are holed into Benghazi. They are quite strong there. It's not likely that they'll be able to break through toward Tripoli. It's a very long way away. Meanwhile, Gaddafi's troops, it's correct, do not seem to be having any mass defections. The troops are stuck along the Mediterranean road. They have defended Sirte, they have defended Jawad, they have defended Ajtabia. If Ajtabia falls to Gaddafi's troops, they will have a direct corridor into Egyptian border. And that's what they are trying to do. So this looks like we are set up for a very long conflict unless warships from the west dock in Benghazi and you have so-called troops on the ground from the United States or NATO. So if there is no assistance from NATO and the United States on the ground, this seems to be a very prolonged civil war and a terrible, terrible situation for the Libyan people. Already there are protests across Tripoli and other places where people are calling for an end to violence. Now, if you're a cynic, you'll say these are organized by Gaddafi and his people, but it's also the case that people do not want to see a 10-year, 12-year no-fly situation. People are aware of what has happened in Iraq during the no-fly situation, the sanctions regime, where hundreds of thousands of people died as a consequence of sanctions. So these things are very clearly known to people, and a protracted situation is only going to bring suffering. There are short-term solutions, but these are not on the horizon of NATO.
The Security Council resolution has called also for ceasefire, which at the moment Gaddafi said he would observe, but it appeared on the ground he did not. And the Benghazi alliance has said it is not going to observe in any case. Secondly, the resolution also calls for not supplying arms to Libyan sides, which means both the sides, not Gaddafi alone. So if you really look at these two aspects of the resolution, it's also clear that there is a loophole which is there, which they seem to be employing in order to violate what is effectively the intent of the resolution.
The resolution is a piece of paper, and from the very first it was clear that it could not be upheld. I mean, as I mentioned, the no-fly zone itself was a meaningless instrument because it would have to mean defending or providing air support for the rebels. So there was no question that this was simply about obligation to protect. Secondly, the resolution did, of course, call for an arms embargo. The people in Benghazi, the rebels, have been asking for resupply. They are running out of munitions. And it seems from a statement made today that they are getting some resupply, not clear from where, and not clear whether this is a direct violation of the Security Council resolution. So the resolution itself is in tatters. One of the important pieces of the resolution was to prevent, to seize or freeze the assets from Gaddafi abroad. Now, I thought this was counterproductive. If I was in a NATO capital, I would say, no, turn those assets over to the rebels and let them use it to arm themselves. If you really want to have mayhem, that would be the way to go. So the resolution itself has become quite meaningless. It seems that everybody has overstepped the bounds of it. To call now for a ceasefire is not clear what that would mean. It's not clear without guarantees that the rebels in Benghazi would honor a ceasefire because they are feeling threatened for their life. I mean, for them, this is an existential problem. If Benghazi falls, they feel they will be slaughtered by Gaddafi's troops, and that is likely. So it's not likely that they would honor a ceasefire. Gaddafi, on the other hand, wants to take Ajdabiya. He wants to have control of the Egyptian border. So it's not likely that he either would honor a ceasefire. So I'm afraid the call for the ceasefire right now, while it is an important one, is not realistic for both parties. Neither is going to honor it.
Vijay, the other part of it is then it could go play in either of the two ways. One is that you have a prolonged period of civil war in which there is a kind of Kurdish protectorate equivalent of created in Benghazi by the NATO forces, or they could try to take out Gaddafi more actively. Now, do you think that the councils now are more in terms of going towards a Kurdish kind of solution, or do you think the way the Western powers are moving, it's really to take over Libya completely, and finally they will have to get boots on the ground?
Well, I mean, there's a practical problem. To maintain a no-fly zone is going to cost them between $1 and $2 billion a month. And even though the Gulf states, the Gulf Cooperation Council, has said that they would help fund this no-fly zone, the austerity measures in Europe and the United States are going to make it very unpopular to finance the no-fly zone for the long term. You know, this is no longer the 1990s when there was at least some money in the exchequers of the North. So I don't think a prolonged no-fly zone is going to be feasible. Already the United States has wanted to shift the burden onto Europe, get whatever financing they can from the Gulf for this, but they are not willing to bear the monetary side of the no-fly zone. So, as it were, would they have boots on the ground? The US Defense Secretary Robert Gates once again said that the Americans cannot get involved in a third occupation. There is simply no capacity for it. So, on pragmatic grounds, at least the United States may not have the stomach for a prolonged occupation. The Republicans are not in favor of it. And however much they'll be chomping on the bit from, say, oil companies and others, I don't see pragmatically much will for an occupation of Libya right now, at least from the United States. The French, that's another story, but they don't have the capacity to take on an occupation of Libya, which will be as complicated and as difficult as the occupation of Iraq between 2003 and 2007. In other words, there'll be hardened Gaddafi loyalists who will go underground and they'll conduct a long-term insurgency against whoever comes in and occupies Libya. So I don't think, if they are at all worried about the pragmatic question, let alone the geostrategic, geopolitical question, I don't think they have the ability. Currently, to my mind, the most reasonable suggestion is firstly for the Egyptian government and the Egyptian army, which is the largest army in the region, to open a corridor between Benghazi and the Egyptian border. I mean, from the western part of the country, the war refugees have been able to leave to go to Tunisia. But war refugees are stuck in the eastern part of the country. There is no way out through the Egyptian side. If the Egyptian army opens a corridor, if the Egyptian army puts pressure on Gaddafi to allow refugees to move without danger, that is the kind of short-term direction that needs to happen, because there are a lot of people who are trapped in these cities who do not want to be stuck there as the violence intensifies. So there are some very short-term things that I think one needs to be asking for, and the fate of the refugees to me is the primary one. In the Iraq conflict, there was no thought given to the refugee problem, and then refugees flooded across into Jordan, very large numbers of people. People were trapped in Baghdad, and it was an intolerable situation from a genuinely humanitarian perspective.
Last question. The Arab Gulf Cooperation Council, is it a bit of a joke that while they send occupation forces to Bahrain, Yemen, 60 protesters are shot in cold blood from sniper fire by Saleh, all welcomed by the Saudis? Now we have suddenly the Gulf Cooperation Council being the prime mover, and some of them willing to join this coalition of the willing to bring democracy to Libya?
Well, the civil war in Libya was the greatest gift given to the royal family of Saudi Arabia and all their friends along the rim of the peninsula. I mean, it has taken attention away from Bahrain. It has taken attention away from Yemen. You know very well that in Yemen already conversations are on for President Saleh to leave. Currently, the only thing that's holding back his departure is the question of control over the security services. President Saleh very cleverly put his sons and nephews in charge of the torture machinery in terms of the internal security, and he is in negotiation right now with the Major General Al-Ahmar to see who is going to take over those institutions, what is going to happen to Saleh's family. So in Yemen, a very convenient transition has been thought through, where the instruments of power will remain intact and Saleh in name will depart. In Bahrain, the Saudis sent in their humanitarian intervention force, as it were, to go and kill protesters, and the GCC said that this is precisely what is needed. I mean, actually, there's nothing hypocritical in what is going on, because there is one basic principle operating between Tripoli and Manama, Bahrain, and that is that the oil has to be secure and that the old conservative powers must remain intact, that there should be no revision of the power equation in the Middle East. They can tolerate the removal of Gaddafi. He was always eccentric, always a problem for them. Recently, he had become very friendly to all of them, but he had a bad history for them. If he goes, that's okay. But the cardinal principle must be that the old conservative authority should remain and revision of power must not be permitted. And so if you look at it like that, there's actually nothing hypocritical about their actions. It's the same principle that they are following. The hypocrisy, of course, is from the ground, where in Bahrain, ordinary people are being shot in the name of a conservative power, and in Libya, a civil war is being helped along because it's in the name of conservative power. So that, to me, is where the hypocrisy is. It's from below. From above, they are perfectly reasonable toward their own interests. And indeed, I would say that they are principled defenders of their own interests.
Well, thanks a lot, Vijay. But I think in the long run, self-interest of this sort can founder on the rocks of the reality. And Libya doesn't really look good in the long run for them. Thanks.
Thank you.